This evening, I just want to say a word, of course, about what the Immaculate Conception is. Put it before us as something to meditate upon. And I'm not sure if there's a lot of practical application, but one thing it will show us as an ancillary point is how we read the scriptures as Catholics. So the Immaculate Conception. I always find it important to say every year what the Immaculate Conception is not. So the Immaculate Conception is not the virginal birth of Jesus. Or the virginal conception, rather, of Jesus, but rather refers to Mary being conceived without sin in her mother's womb, which tradition tells us is Anne. So Mary was conceived without original sin and did not commit a sin throughout her entire life. This is obviously a distinctly Catholic teaching. Our Protestant brothers and sisters do not believe it, and is a very controversial teaching, where many people feel like Catholics, in teaching this about Mary, are not only not saying things that are not in the scriptures, that it's non-biblical, that it's anti-biblical. It actually goes against what the scriptures say. For instance, like in Romans chapter 3, it says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so Protestants will look at that and say, well, what do Catholics teach about the Immaculate Conception of Mary? Great question. So in our first reading, we hear from the book of Genesis. This is immediately following the fall of Adam and Eve, and God is declaring his judgment upon the serpent. And in the midst of that, he says this, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, Eve, and between your offspring, the serpent's, and hers, Eve. He will strike at your head while you strike at his heel. If you know anything about snakes, if you want to kill a snake, you want to crush its head. So there's this mysterious prophecy that this head will be crushed, but at the same time it will bite the heel. If you get bit on the heel by a poisonous snake, you're probably going to die. So this mysterious prophecy where both seem to lose in this exchange. And in the early church, what they called this, the Jews thought this, and ancient Christians, they called this the proto-evangelium, the first gospel. And there were ancient Jews who thought that this was speaking about the time of the Messiah, that this prophecy would come true in the time of the Messiah. Now, when you read the scriptures, it tells us about Jesus, the Messiah, about being the new Adam. It talks about that Romans chapter 5, 1 Corinthians 15, that Jesus is the new Adam. And so when ancient Christians read the Bible, and they knew that sin entered the world through the cooperation of a man and a woman, through Adam and Eve. Who was at fault? They both were. But then God made this prophecy that he would undo the problem. So they said, well, if Jesus is the new Adam, as the scriptures say, then who is the new Eve? Who did he cooperate with to bring salvation into the world? And what we did hear about in our gospel is the Annunciation, that God asked, this is so important, Mary was a real person and had a human will. And she could have said no. But God asked her, does she want to consent that when God would take flesh, he would do so in her womb? Does she want to be the one by which God would come into the world? And what's very beautiful is in Greek, the angel says to her, hail, full of grace. In Greek, that's kare, ke kare tomene. And ke kare tomene is from the Greek word charis, meaning grace. But she's ke kare tomene. She is full of grace. And if you notice in the gospel, he doesn't call her Mary. We add that in the rosary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. But the angel doesn't say, Hail Mary. The angel says, Hail ke kare tomene. He calls her full of grace as if it's her title. You are full of grace. And she is the one, through the Immaculate Conception, she was born without sin. So back to the early church fathers. If Jesus was the new Adam and Mary was the new Eve, then they thought this. Well, how many people in the Bible were born without sin? Anybody know? How many people in the Bible were created without sin? Is it 1? Is it 2? The answer is it's 4. Jesus and Mary, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were created without sin. And at one point they fall into sin, which is, of course, we're reading an account of. So the early church fathers thought this. If Jesus and Mary are the new Adam and the new Eve, and the first Adam and the new Eve were created without sin, then how on earth could the new Adam and the new Eve be created with sin? And to make that inference is simply the teaching of the Immaculate Conception. And they also thought, if the new Adam and the new Eve are the remedy to sin, then it could make no sense if either one of them fell into sin, because then they'd be back in the situation of our first parents, Adam and Eve. But they're trying to fix that problem. And this is a very ancient reading in the church. In the 2nd century, somebody named St. Irenaeus of Lyons says the knot of Eve's disobedience was loosed by the obedience of Mary. So that Mary is the new Eve. And one other point to put on that is, if you notice, before Eve is called Eve, she's only called that after the fall, which is ironic, because her name in Hebrew means life. And she not only gives her children life, she also gives them death. Thanks, Eve. But that's been passed on to all of us, of course. But before that, 12 times in Hebrew, she's referred to as woman. Woman, 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 woman. And if you ever notice, in John's gospel, Jesus, you know what he calls his mom? Woman. Go ahead and try to call your mom woman and see how that turns out. Not going to work, right? But Jesus keeps doing that. And in John chapter 2, the wedding feast of Cana, woman, what is that to me? My hour's not come. When he's dying on the cross, he tells Mary, woman, behold your son. And then he says to John, John, behold your mother. So when he's talking directly to her, he calls her woman. But then when he's talking to John, he calls her mother. And then in the book of Revelation, it keeps telling us about this woman who's in heaven. She has a crown of 12 stars standing on the moon in front of the sun. And she's a queen. She's a heavenly queen. Well, this woman in the New Testament is the new Eve. That's who she is. And what John is telling us is, yes, sin came to the world through the cooperation of a man and a woman, and now salvation has come to the world through the cooperation of a man and a woman. Last thing I want to say, in our second reading, we hear from the book of Ephesians. It's talking about an image of the church. And it's saying that as he chose us, the followers of Christ in him, before the foundation of the world, to be holy and without blemish before him. And without blemish in Latin is immaculatus. That's where we get the word immaculate from. Macula is the Latin word for stain. And so immaculate is to be without stain. That's when your parents say, you better clean your room and it better be immaculate. It better be without stain, right? And so what is it saying? The church will one day together collectively be in heaven with God, where we'll be incapable of sinning. The saints of God in heaven are incapable of sinning. They are immaculate. They're without blemish and holy. And so Mary experiences now what we will all experience. She experienced in her earthly life, what God willing all of us will experience in eternity. She's like an icon of what God made all of us for. He didn't make any of us for sin. He made it all of us for holiness. And so Mary got to participate that through this special grace she received to be free from the stain of original sin, to be immaculate. So that's why when we read the scriptures as Catholics, we read the Old and the New Testament in union with each other, and we read it in the living tradition of the church. That's how the church came to this realization that Mary was conceived without sin, and where she was throughout her earthly life is where we want to be for all of eternity.